So now it's my pleasure to pass the baton to Dr. Sharon Phillips. She is an incredible woman, has a lot of great information to share with us, and I know that you're going to love her presentation.
Thank you, Debbie. I wanted to welcome all of you today and let you know that there are pros and cons about grieving during the period of COVID-19. One of the cons is we're not able to do all this in person. So I am coming to you live and in person from Florida. I had my ticket purchased by Companions on a Journey and I was all set to come. And as things got closer, I realized I don't think this is happening. And so the pro is that I have some money on my ticket that I can still use later for a flight, or if it's really cheap, a couple other flights. The con is that I can't be with all of you in person. I am on the advisory board and have been for some time with Companions on a Journey. And I had a private practice there in Cincinnati for over 20 years. And now I'm working with our seniors here in Florida. I'm going into assisted living facilities and nursing homes and working with those who are often marginalized in our society. And I didn't realize until I started this job just how much I love seniors. I just did not know. As many of you know, I worked with kids, teens, and adults in private practice when I was there. So today, I wanted to talk about, okay, I'm back. I wanted to talk about layers of grief and layers of life. And this came to mind about life is like an onion. You peel it off one layer at a time and sometimes you weep. So we often talk about grief as far as an onion because we have so many different layers. And as I was really thinking about this presentation, it came to mind just how many layers we have in our lives. And so I just thought it might be helpful for us to think about that today. The first layer has to do with how we come into this world. We all come into this world with individual personalities. We're shaped by genetics, passed down from our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. Some of us are gentle and passive. Some of us are nervous and high-strung. Some of us are laid back and go with the flow type people. Some of us are highly sensitive. Some of us have thick skins. My grandmother used to say, it takes all kinds of people to make a world. And that is so true. That's the first layer. What do we come into the world with? The second layer is we're born into families that mold and shape us. So the second layer is life events and life circumstances, things that happen to us. We may have come from strong and loving and nurturing families. We may have come from dysfunctional, abused, or hurting families. We may have grown up poor or wealthy or with one parent or two. We may have grown up with our grandparents or in foster care. We may have grown up in a group home. We may have encountered loss early on. We may have been abused. We may have been nurtured and valued. We may have been able to coast through most of our life relatively unscathed. But take for a moment and just think about the things that you've been through. We've got the layer of what we come into the world with, our genetics, our predisposition to certain things. Add the layer of the things that we go through in life. It's kind of like our nature for layer one and then our nurture for layer two. Moving on to layer three. We have our daily routines. We have our regular busy lives. We get up, we get ready for work, we walk or feed our dog or our pets. We go to work, school, or home. That might have changed in this COVID-19 crisis. We come home, sometimes we'll run kids to activities in our regular everyday lives. We'll do homework with them, fix dinner, They call the 5 o'clock the witching hour, because that's when everybody is hangry and tired. And when I have 3 boys now, ages 17, 19, and 21. And at 5 o'clock, historically, years ago, they would all be crying at that time, and I wanted to cry along with them. But we're creatures of habit. We tend to like the sameness and the predictable, the ordinary and the expected. We tend to kind of crave our routines. We have the same parking spots. We have the same place that we always sit at church, and we might feel very out of sorts if someone else is in our spot, because we kind of claim them territorial. We might not do what my dog does when she claims a spot and I take her on a walk, but we do claim our spots. So our daily routines is another layer. Layer 4 is our grief. We've got all this going on, right? We've got at least 3 layers kind of going on every single day. And then we're slapped with this layer when someone that we love dies. And our snow globe world is shaken up, and everything goes up in the air and comes back down, and it's disorganized, and it's unfamiliar, and it's broken. Another analogy that I think is very fitting is that our train is derailed. We're left on the side of the tracks. We're in pain, we're confused, we're shattered, and we're never to be the same. We have trouble making sense of ourselves. We have trouble making sense of our lives. We have trouble making sense of anything. We don't recognize who we are or what our lives should look like now. That's our layer 4. And if that weren't enough, let's add a layer 5. Layer 5 is this coronavirus pandemic, aka COVID-19. Our world encounters the coronavirus pandemic. I have 2 children. My oldest 2 children are in the Philippines. And in January, I saw on my phone, we were texting about a virus that was in China. And as a joke, my boys and we started looking at face masks, and because people were talking about face masks. And we started looking at all the different face masks there were, and the funny patterns, and the ones that looked like you were in the future, and the ones that looked like, you know, had little things painted on them. And I thought, I wonder if I should send you guys some face masks. And they're like, no, Mom, we're fine. This is nothing. So I didn't order them. They were all over Amazon. I could get them at very cheaply right away. But I didn't do it. Fast forward just 2 months from there, within 1 week in March, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, our predictable patterns and our expected routines that we talked about in layer 3, those were gone. When we started experiencing things that we've never experienced before, we were told to stay home, to stay 6 feet apart from people, to not go to work, to not send our children to school, to not visit our parents or our grandparents, to mostly stay inside, to stay off the beach, to not go to restaurants, to not get our hair cut, to not get our nails done, to wear masks, to not shake hands, to not hug, to not kiss, to not embrace, to stock up on groceries, on cleaning supplies, on medicine to boost our immune system, on medicine to treat our possible flu symptoms if we have them. Our children stay home, our college students return home, our husbands and wives stay home. Our news programs can't keep up with the ever-changing landscape. Get tested, don't get tested. This is just the flu. This is nothing like the flu. This can only kill old people. This can kill anyone. We have over 641,000 people in our country being diagnosed. So surely we know someone who has COVID-19. And with over 28,000 deaths in America alone, we may also know someone who has died. And death from COVID-19 or death from another illness or an accident or suicide is different now than it has been at any other time. People are dying alone. They're in isolation, and this is out of necessity and out of precaution, but it's also out of sight. And funerals are drive-through or webcammed or not at all. So what do we do with our new grief that has sprung up now during COVID-19? And what do we do with our residual grief that has been there before COVID-19? When we can't put our arms around another for comfort, when we can't sit in a close circle and share our thoughts and feelings, when we can't go out for brunch and dinner and sit and talk and have coffee or a drink with our support persons, where does grief go now? Anne-Marie's going to talk a little bit later about COVID-19 and how it's affected us in our grief. But right now we want to take a poll and ask you all, which layer of the 5 layers that we just talked about do you feel most challenged by right now? So we've got a question, a poll there, and if you would stop for a minute and think which layer you feel most challenged by, and pick that, and then hit submit. I want to just, while we're waiting for those results, just share that there's 2 nursing homes that I continue to go in, and I put on a gown and a mask and gloves, and I look like I'm about to do surgery. And I do that out of protection for them, because at first I was going into about 8 different assisted living care facilities during the course of the week. And we know in this pandemic that the people that are in the assisted living facilities are not the ones that have the disease. It's the people that are coming in that are bringing it. So I wanted to protect my seniors. And so we were kind of in the process of starting to put some telehealth in, put some little cameras in, or use an iPad, or use like an Alexa show tablet, just to be able to talk and give support to our patients without having to present the risk of being with them in person. And it broke my heart when I was there all garbed up, and I was entering one of the facilities, because there were a couple facilities that we had not yet had the telehealth on board. And there was a lady that wasn't my patient, but I recognized her from the facility. And she was in a wheelchair, and she had some dementia, and she spoke Spanish, and she was very confused, and she reached her arm for me, and she was crying, and she was speaking in Spanish. And I couldn't touch her to comfort her. And I had my mask on, so I couldn't show the empathy except for in my eyes. And she wanted to get on the elevator with me, and I had to kind of let her know, no, she had to stay there, I have to go. And that's just a snapshot of what people feel every day with COVID-19. Do we have the results? Oh, yes, we do. So look at this. Over half of all the people tuning in today are struggling with layer 4, the grief after the death of someone you love, or layer 5, the COVID-19 pandemic. There's somebody struggling with every layer. And what I wanted us to realize is that sometimes we kind of aren't really tuned into why are we struggling so much, and we go, I don't know why, I'm just so bent out of shape. And there are 5 layers going on at the very least. So I just wanted us to acknowledge and to intentionally remember that. So I want to talk a little bit about what is grief. We use that word all the time. We talk about grief and mourning, but I wanted to share that this is what we would call a Captain Obvious statement. My boys would say, Captain Obvious, Mom. But grief comes from loss, but it's important for us to know that, because if we don't have a loss, then we don't have grief. And sometimes we don't have grief where we feel like we should. for example, my my mother is from the Philippines, and my parents met in the Philippines when my dad was in the Peace Corps. And my mom and dad were both teachers, and my dad was a math teacher. My mom was a reading teacher, and he was there from Chicago with the Peace Corps. And he tutored my mom in math, and they fell in love. And my mother married my dad and came here, and I didn't know my family in the Philippines that well. I did go visit them several times over the years, but I didn't have a close relationship with my family there. So when my mom's mom died, my maternal grandmother, I felt like I should feel grief because that was my grandmother, but I didn't because I wasn't attached to her. And if we don't have attachment, we don't have loss. And if we don't have loss, we don't have grief. And so sometimes it can feel like it's not valid because I should feel bad after the loss of my grandmother. But if I don't know her, how can I, if I'm not attached to her, how can I grieve that loss? And attachment really comes from love. There are so many great studies about attachment. And one of the earliest studies about attachment was when they were able to study toddlers and their mothers and have them both in a room behind a one-way mirror where people doing the research could look and see. And what they saw was they would have the mothers and the kids in the room, and then they would have the mothers leave, and they would see how the children dealt with it, and then they would have the mothers come back, and they would see how the children dealt with it. And the three main types of attachment that the researchers found that the children exhibited, one was the secure attachment, where they were sad that their moms left, but then they were able to kind of occupy themselves with other things that were going on in the room. And when their mother re-entered again, they were very glad to see her. So that's a secure attachment where we can be away from the person that we love and we miss them, but we can kind of like get along. And then when they come back, we're really happy to see them. There were other children, though, that displayed what they called an anxious attachment, where they were just inconsolable when their mothers left, and they could not console themselves during the time that she was gone. And when she came back, they just could not leave her side. They were just anxious, anxious, anxious. And then there were the third kind, where that attachment was very ambivalent and very disorganized. So it was almost as if when the moms left, the children didn't really care. And then when the moms came back, they just didn't really care either. So they really kind of tried to and learned how to fend for themselves. And that's another type of attachment. So our attachment comes from love. And that's where we get, grief from. If you follow that chain, grief comes from loss comes from attachment, and attachment comes from love. One of the things about grief that I think is really important for us to know is that grief is a process and it's not an event. And you know how you know things up here, but then later on you know things in here? I had that experience happen to me. So I was introduced to this whole, what I call kind of like a club of grief. Because if you haven't experienced a loss, you kind of know about it, but you don't like know it. So I almost sometimes talk about it kind of like we're in a club. Like, you get it if you've had a loss. We can speak this language that you understand, even if the loss is different. What happened for me that kind of introduced me, where I got indoctrinated, if you will, to this club, is that when I was 19 and a sophomore at Xavier University in Cincinnati, my mother passed away, and she had cancer, and she died at the age of 44. And that was my first real big loss. So I thought I kind of knew about grief being a process and not an event. However, when I was 40, I was unexpectedly pregnant. My husband and I were unexpectedly pregnant, and then I unexpectedly had a miscarriage. And I found out that a miscarriage is a process and not an event. I had always thought it was like it happened and then it was over. But I realized that it's not. That you find out that there's no heartbeat, and then you are waiting to see what should I do about this baby that I have that's no longer living. And they have options, and you have to choose options. And I found that this is an event. This is not an event. This is a process, and it's a process that's going to take time, and it's hard work. I see several clients now in teletherapy from Ohio, from when I moved here to Florida, that wanted to continue with me. And some of them are really great examples of how grief is work. They will tell me that they don't understand why they're so tired all the time, because they're sleeping well, and they're doing their jobs, and they're exercising, and they're eating right most of the time, and they don't understand, like, I don't know why I'm so tired. And it's because grief is work. They call it grief work because it's work. It requires a lot of our energy, and we already have 3 layers at the very least that we're dealing with every day. Then you throw in grief, then you throw in everything that comes with it, you throw in COVID-19. We would like to know, in what ways have you experienced grief? And I'm thinking this is okay, great, thank you. So this is a poll question where we're talking about the signs and symptoms of grief. And so if you could take a minute on this poll and check off any and all of the physical signs of grief that you have experienced. If your loss is recent, you might be experiencing some of these right now. If your loss is in the past, you may not be experiencing these now, or you may be, but just if you could check off the physical signs of grief. And which have you experienced? When I was pregnant and I had symptoms of whatever complaint I had, people often said, it's just pregnancy. So it's kind of like everything was like chalked up to pregnancy. I heard a story about a woman who actually was diagnosed later with narcolepsy, but she could not keep her eyes open when she was pregnant. And of course, the doctor said, it's pregnancy. You're tired. Your body's working really hard. All your nutrients are going to the baby. You know, it's just pregnancy. Well, she was diagnosed with narcolepsy, but they chalked it all up to pregnancy. And actually, grief is so similar. We can chalk up a lot of those things to grief. So let's see if, and I'm not sure if we're going to, yep, poll results for that. So 74, look at the grief work, lack of energy, physical exhaustion. 74% of all of you are experiencing that or have. That's the biggest one. Let's look at social grief. What social signs of grief have you experienced? And with this, we're talking about how your grief has changed your social interactions. So check any of these that apply. And it could be all the above. Sometimes we might want to be with people, sometimes we don't. My husband and I cared for his parents for 4 years until we lost each of them within a couple years of each other. And we lost my mother-in-law, who was blind and on dialysis, that we did for her here in our home just in January. And what I found was that sometimes my husband wanted to be alone and sometimes he didn't. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with these poll results, that People feel distracted. They have difficulty starting an activity or staying with an activity. Some people don't want to be alone, or we don't want to be with others, or we just feel restless. We don't know what we want. We kind of go back and forth. And then we have emotional grief. And what signs of grief in the emotional spectrum have you experienced? We're interested in knowing about that from you. Don't forget to click the submit on the bottom of that poll so that we can get your answers. And so our poll results are the two most common ones are the crying and the forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating. And we know that grief is not just about death, that grief is about, can be from a divorce. One of my clients said they had separation brain when they're separated from their spouse, where they were distracted and they couldn't pay attention to what was going on. So we have a lot of ways that we experience grief. This is an unhelpful model of grief. We've got the stages of grief. Start here where the blue man is, follow the line, and then you end up at the yellow dot. That's pretty much how I think a lot of us experience it, if not all of us, but it's not very helpful. It doesn't give us any direction. The journey of grief is a very helpful model of grief that I found along the way. And what I love about this is, because I'm a visual person, this model is a visual model, but it's a visual model that I can relate to a lot easier than I can that squiggly line that just goes, up, down, and all around. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk through each of these parts of it. There are actually 4 parts of this journey, and we're going to go through each of these. And I want you all to actually think about and reflect about where you think you are, because we're going to ask you in a little bit to share with us, where do you think you are on this journey? And the first part is when we're accepting the reality of the loss. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was one of the first people to actually come up with stages of grief, talked about denial. And we're trying to accept the reality of the loss. Like, this can't be true. No, this can't be happening. I don't believe it. So we're protesting and searching. So the reality of the loss is this protest of where we can't believe it. We feel numb. We are extremely angry. What I like to tell people is that anger is always the secondary emotion. Anger is never a primary emotion. Our primary emotion, our first feeling, is hurt or pain, and out of that comes anger. And so when we're feeling angry, and we're going to talk about gender grief in just a little bit, just touch on it, we have to really know, where is that anger coming from? But protest, we can feel guilty. We talk about survivor's guilt. Go back one moment for me, Grace, to that. Thank you. Guilt, where we might have survivor's guilt, where we're actually trying to understand, why are we here? Why did other people not get to be here and we're here? And the physical symptoms that we talked about are all a part of protest. Thanks, Grace. Accepting the reality of the loss also involves searching, which is when we're kind of going down the pit. And this is what a lot of you talked about, where you're feeling restless, in the physical symptoms, the social symptoms of grief, where we're preoccupied with what's going on. So I am thinking all about my relationship with that person that died, and I can't stop thinking about all the specifics, all the consuming nature, with all the layers. What I was struck by when we lost my mother-in-law, because I'd never been so like the key person involved in everything that had to do with the arrangements for the funeral. My husband was just not able to. He had lost his dad. This was his mom. They were very close. He wasn't able to function. So I did it all. And that was on top of everything else, all the other layers. And I'm working. That's why we have to like take a leave of absence to get things done. And we can be very preoccupied with that so that other things don't seem important. People are talking about this celebrity or this, trend that's happening, and you don't care because all you can think about is the person that you lost. We can have a lack of harmony. We can be snapping at each other in our family and not really understand why. We're just irritable because of grief. And we can feel like our self-esteem is really taking a nosedive. And again, if we have the guilt and the shame and what could I have, could I have done differently, that all goes into self-esteem. The very bottom of that journey of grief, the pits of the well, if you will, is despair. And despair is such a difficult feeling to experience that it would be very normal and understandable for those of us that just kind of wanted to skip over it. Can't we just jump from searching to reorganization in our model there without going into that pit? Because that pit looks really deep and really dark and really lonely. So I'm thinking I'm not going to go there. I'm fine. Life goes on. Well, if we avoid that pit of despair where the agony is, where we feel anguish, depression, where we feel so alone, we don't have any meaning, what we find with grief is that it's kind of like we brush that under the carpet. And we all know that when we brush things under the carpet enough, we tend to trip over it. And that's what will happen. Despair, we have to get to that point. Now, if you're a Christian and a believer and you feel like, well, we shouldn't despair because God has provided an eternity and a future for us. This is not about that. This is about being human. This is about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, God, if it is your will, Father, please take this cup from me. I do not want to go through this. Because Jesus was fully man and fully human, anything that he did, we know it's okay to do. Jesus grieved. Jesus wept. And it's fine for us also to be in that pit of despair. There is a journey upward. And notice that it's not like a easy. So the falling down is quote unquote easy in that it happens to us. The coming up the hill on the journey of grief is also grief work. And we do have to work towards this next stage of reorganization. We have bursts of energy where we feel like, you know what, I got this. And then we feel so exhausted. If we go back to work for the first time after losing somebody, we might find that just greeting people and like looking at our desk wore us out, and we were in bed for the next 2 days because we have a burst of energy and then it's gone. We have intermittent interest. We're interested in things and then we don't care. We can feel indifferent. The fatigue is there in just about every stage here. We can feel like detached and apathetic, kind of like people talk about the experience of feeling, it feels surreal. It feels like it's happening to me, but it's not happening. It's happening around me, but I'm not involved in it at all. I'm not really feeling like I'm in, this world. It's like a play going on around me and I'm just here, but I don't really feel a part of it. And when we're reorganizing, that's what we're doing, is we're kind of trying to figure out like, what do I do now? What is this new normal? I don't like this new normal. I want to go back. But you can't go backwards. But if that's all you want, it can just feel so difficult. The top of this, when you arrive at the end of this journey of grief, is this reinvestment where we're finding an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. It's not like I'm over it, because we're never over it. we do learn how to live with it. And people talk about grief not going away, but you learn to carry it differently. You have a scar, you have phantom pain, in your heart. You are trying to figure out, who am I now? There's a beautiful book that was written 20 plus years ago, and it's called Am I Still a Sister? And a mom wrote it for her child after her daughter died, because the other daughter didn't know, am I still a sister? And she asked her mom that. And so we have to try to find out, who am I now? Am I still a wife? Am I still a husband? Who am I with my parents both gone and I don't have those roots, that foundation? We've got to find out who we are now. We emerge with our new identity. We would like to know here at Companions on a Journey, where do you feel that you are right now in this journey of grief? So loss is right when it happens, when we're at that edge of the cliff. Protest is when we're going downward. Searching is on the way down. Despair is the pit at the bottom. Reorganization is the first part going up, and then reinvestment is the last part going up. Tell us where you are now. And know that wherever you are is where you need to be. If you're 5 years out and you are still in despair, it is okay to be there and talk to people about how to move on from there. You don't want to get stuck there forever, but people need different periods of time to be there. Look at that. Some of you are in that state of loss, and anybody that's in reorganization and reinvestment has been there too. It's encouraging to see that a lot of you are on the upwards of the hill of the grief work. And we know it is grief work. And that's why our support groups are so important, because we can be on the other side of the grief journey and really help along those that are just falling down or in that pit of despair. Grief is a process that allows us to let go of that which was and be ready for that which is to come. We grieve in different ways based upon our relationship to the deceased. And not in name only, but in relationship. I told you the story about my grandmother and how I felt probably more intense pain over other losses than I did about my grandmother, because of my relationship to her. Our relationship to the deceased, we'll talk about hopefully in another video at another time. Sheila will probably have a series of these that we'll be posting and hosting. And we'll talk in more detail at another time about disenfranchised grief, which is grief that is not recognized or sanctioned by our society. And it can be from a same-sex partner that is not recognized or sanctioned if we're not out and letting other people know about our identity, our romantic relationship with that person. It can be the loss of somebody that we didn't even know, but we just feel the pain. When I read these stories of COVID-19, and I read about the healthcare workers or the pregnant people where perhaps they have died, but their babies have survived, I'm struck by sadness. I don't have a relationship with them, so it can feel disenfranchised. But our relationship to the deceased will grieve in different ways based on that. We'll grieve in different ways based upon our own personal history of loss. So remember back when we were talking about our layers, and that second layer was about our circumstances and our life events, things that have happened to us. If we've had loss upon loss upon loss in our lives, when we encounter another loss, it rearouses all those other types of losses. That's what grief does, unfortunately. It like reawakens those feelings. So when we attend a funeral, perhaps of like a coworker's parent that we didn't really know that well, and then we are struck by the intensity of emotions we feel at that funeral, it's not just about that coworker's parent. It's about the losses that we've had that have led us up to here. If it's your first loss, your first big loss, and you have what I call baptism by fire, and you're just like, blown away by this incredible loss, and that's your first experience, that's going to be really different than if you've had other losses, perhaps that were kind of your induction into loss. And so you kind of understand what you are experiencing and how this, kind of journey goes, this roller coaster, the slinky, the waves in and out of feelings. But it's all impacts about our personal history of loss. What I'd like to do before I talk about how we grieve in different ways based upon gender is we would like to just hear from a few people about, just in 1 or 2 sentences, if you want to think about for a moment, what do you think is a gender difference in how grief is expressed? So if you would like to answer that, and we're just going to have have somebody raise their hand at the very bottom of your screen. There's a way that you can raise your hand in Zoom, and you can answer that. And if you'd like to answer that, and then we'll share it with everybody, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and we'll read that.
Julie, I'm gonna unmute you so everyone can hear.
Okay, it's saying I'm still muted. Technology is grand. Okay, I think it's working now. Hi, Sharon, I miss you. So one of the things that I've noticed is just how differently men are permitted to grieve in our society. Women can spend an awful lot more time crying and being sad and being down, and people are better there for them, I think, and support them, where a lot of times men are expected to suck it up and be a man and not show their feelings. I think that's changing, but there's still an awful lot of that in society. And it's like at the beginning, you're allowed to show your feelings, but then you need to get over it.
Thank you, Julie. We really appreciate you sharing that.
Jake, I'm gonna unmute you now.
I think we're working on unmuting Jake.
I think he might be having some problems with his mic.
Okay.
Got it. Okay, can you all hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, good morning, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. Sharon, I just want to expound even more on what Julie just mentioned in regards to men having a difficult time or doesn't express their emotions when they lose someone. I lost my wife 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years in June. And what I noticed or realized in attending the Grieve to Peace sessions is that there's not many men there. And I've been going pretty much during that whole period. To even accept help, I had to acknowledge the fact that I needed it. And based on the fact that I thought I could handle it, I'll be all right, I'm fine, I can go through this process pretty much by myself. Well, I realized probably a month or two going into this that that was not going to happen, that I do needed to be around other people who was experiencing some of the same feelings that I was experiencing. And I lost my mom probably about 6 years ago. I lost my dad when I was about 17 years ago, but none of those two compare the intensity of grief that I have in losing my wife. She's my high school sweetheart. She gave me 3 beautiful children. I've been knowing her probably all except for 15 years of my life. And when that was taken away from me, when I retired at the end of 2017, and she passed away in 2018. So I have all these aspirations that we're going to spend quality time with one another. And that was pretty much taken away from me. So I had a difficult time accepting that. And being a male, we felt that we got it, we'll be okay, we can walk through this pretty much by ourselves. And as I just mentioned, it just didn't happen. So when I attended the Grief to Peace, I learned that there were other people there that was going through the same journey as I was. The difference was that there wasn't that many male there to really much express or let go of those feelings, because we have a tendency of internalizing everything. And when we do that, we pretty much mess ourselves up, because that affects our daily living, that affects how we
Yes.
cooperate and associate within a society. So I have to learn quickly, and because I went back to work part-time, I was very
Yes.
fortunate enough that
Thank
I
you,
was,
Jake.
okay, I'm
That-
running out of time. Okay.
Jake,
Yes.
we're going to make sure, and I thank you so much for sharing, because there are not even as many men involved in this webinar today. So I want to
Wow,
thank
there
you
you
for
go.
sharing,
Thank you, Sharon.
and let you know that we're going to hope to have another webinar that will just be on gender differences, because if we have our full day retreat, we have a whole section on that. So we just so appreciate you being here and appreciate you sharing, and
Thank you for having me.
thank you. Let's just touch upon a few of the other differences. One is that we'll grieve in different ways based upon our temperament and our personality. If we tend to congregate with other people when we are sad and we need comfort, then we might do that in our grief. Or we might be more introverted and really not want to do that much at all and really be by ourselves. So if you think about that first layer that we talked about, that affects our grief. We grieve in different ways based upon our age and our cognitive level. So there are people like Companions on a Journey that really specialize in children's grief and understanding from the developmental age that a child or a teen is in, how they process their grief. And it's also true for people that have developmental disabilities that may be adults physically and developmentally, but cognitively they may be more at the ages of 12 or 9 or 5. And they process grief very differently. And our age as well affects the way that we grieve. We grieve in different ways based upon the way in which the person died. We'll talk about COVID-19 and the impact of that in a bit. But we will also, Anne-Marie will talk about that a little bit more. But if a person died suddenly, if a person took their own life and died by suicide, that's a very complicated grief for us to go through, because we're left with questions that we'll never have answers to. If there was cancer, like my mom, she actually had cancer 7 years earlier when I was 12, and it went into remission. And then she died when I was 19. And so I had a lot of time with her, and that helped my grief. But if it's sudden, if it's a car accident, if it's an overdose, if it is a murder, a homicide, the way in which somebody dies really affects the way that we grieve. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to.